Sechet Chullin is Daf Lamed Zayin. Moving along pretty quickly, as we always do in Daf Yomi. And it's about to get hard, so enjoy tonight being a little easier, because last week was not easy, our Tuma and Tahara. And next week is when it starts getting to be really tough. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. So Navi, get ready. You
You know
got
what? It's tough, but it's more interesting. So,
Yeah, it's a lot of next parak, which we'll get to in a few days, is Elo Treifot, where we go through the list of all the different Treifot, and they're very technical and they're very hard. If you have no medical knowledge or no animal knowledge, and even if you do, there's tremendous disagreement all the time on what we're talking about. So, anyways, we'll do it like we do everything. But today we're not. Today's an easier Mishnah. So today in Daf Lamed Zayin, we're on the third line from the top. It says the Mishnah. Hashochet et hamisukenet. If you shecht an animal that is ill, that's how I would translate misukenet, or deathly ill, to be honest, because really it means that it's about to die, essentially. And you shechted, now, of course, in those times, and probably today also they do it, animals are very valuable, and a dead animal has no value, right? A dead or very little value. A dead animal has almost no value. A live animal, of animal that you shechted while it was alive is tremendously valuable. You can eat the meat, that's the main thing, right? So they would rush to shecht the animals before they died. The question is, did you kill an animal that was basically dead? So you shechted a misukenet. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, it's only kosher if it moves after you shechted. Ad shetiffarches biyad v'regel. If it I don't know how we translate tfarches in English, but it moves with its hand and its feet, meaning it has some reflexive action after it dies. Now we'll see in the Gemara what that means after it dies, but it has to pirches, which has to move its hand and its foot.
he jerks both with a foreleg and a hind leg.
Okay, he translates mifarches as jerks, but okay, but pirches just it means like a reflexive act, not a controlled action, but
Yeah.
an action. So Reb Shimon Gamliel says both the yad and the regel. Rabbi Eliezer says it's daya im zinka. It's okay if the animal is zinka, and Rashi explains zinka means that it moans basically, right? I'm sorry, no, not moans. It spurts. Spurts is the word zinka, meaning that the blood when you shecht it spurts out. But if the blood doesn't spurt out, it means that this animal's basically had no blood going. Its heart was about to stop. And if there's just like a trickle of blood and not a flow of blood, then you can't eat that animal. Rabbi Shimon, now Rabbi Shimon says, well, it's very interesting because what if you shecht at night, right? What if you have poor lighting? So Hashochet balayla, you have to have enough lighting to know you did shechita properly, but you don't know if the blood flowed out after you shechted. You wake up the next morning, you see the walls. Now we're going to see in the Gemara, Shmuel explains the walls do not mean the walls of your house. They mean the walls of the animal, meaning you shechted the neck of the animal and you get up the next morning and you look at the skin and the inside around where the blood vessels are. If you find that the blood spurted out to those areas, kshera. That is kosher. Shezinka, because you know that the blood spurted out. So if the blood basically saturated and got red or black, the area around the walls of the shechita, meaning the neck of the animal, then you know the animal was alive. Otherwise, you have to be doubtful that maybe you killed an animal that was basically dying. Ukimidat Rebbe Eliezer, and he agrees with Rebbe Eliezer that it's zinka that matters, it's not moving of the limbs. And the third opinion in the Mishnah, Chachamim omrim, ad shetifarches o biyad o beregel, right? They have an alternative that you have to jerk, the animal has to jerk, but doesn't need to have the hand and the foot, like the Tanakama said, like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. It's one or the other. Oh, ad shetikashkish biznava, or unless its tail twitches. So it's another action that can happen again after shechita, which indicates that the animal still had some life left inside of it, and that basically you weren't killing a dead animal. Now, these are the shiurim. Says the Mishnah, these are true for echad behema daka. Where am I? I switched. Echad behema daka, echad behema gasa, whether it's a small animal like a cat, like a sheep or a goat, or a behema gasa like a cow. But behema daka shepashta yadav lo hichsira psula. If an animal, a small animal, sticks out its hand, its foreleg, after shechita, but doesn't contract it, it's not bring it back, that's puzzle. She'eno ela hotzaat nefesh bilvad. That just means it's dying. It doesn't mean that it was still alive enough to do an action. B'medvar memurim, that's only true, says the Mishnah, all of this, shaita b'cheskat misukenet. That's if the animal was ill, right? So there was a chazakah, you were worried basically that this animal was at death's door. So then you have to have a siman that it was full of life even after shechita, or not full of life, but had some life. Avim hayta b'cheskat bria, if it was a normal, healthy animal, afilu ein ba'echad mikol hasimanim halalu kshera. Even if nothing happens, you shech the animal and the blood doesn't spurt out, and it doesn't move its limbs, and it doesn't wag its tail, it doesn't matter. If it was b'cheskat healthy, then you assume that it is still healthy. Okay, so that is the Mishnah about an animal that's called misukenet, which means an animal that is very ill. And we're about to get into a complicated Gemara, even though I said it was an easy daf. But the issues in our Gemara are that we have in the Torah two categories of animals that are not kosher. One is a nevela, right? And a nevela on its surface just means the animal that's dead, right? That wasn't shechted. And in nevela, you're not allowed to eat it. It's tameh, right? All the things we know about nevela. There's another category of animal called treifa, right? And remember that a treifa is an animal that has a wound that is injured. It's alive at this point. It's a treifa. It was alive, I guess, when it was a treifa. You then shecht a treifa, so it's not a nevela and it's not tameh, but it's not allowed to be eaten because it had an injury while it was alive that would have resulted in death. That's how we usually understand it. Again, next parak we'll talk through a lot of the treifot. So one of the, I think, points that is really important to note, which our Gemara will make over and over, is that every animal that dies, right, a natural death, obviously was sick, right, or something, right? So an animal that dies a natural death, that's a nevela, something had happened to it, but that doesn't automatically make it a treifa, because a treifa is by definition something where, literally means it was ripped apart, right? It was injured by another animal, where there's an injury in the animal that you can see. When an animal dies of natural causes, it's not necessarily a treifa on its way to death, okay? And that's really important for distinguishing why every nevela is not also a treifa, right? Why don't you say that every animal that drops dead was dying? So why isn't every nevela a treifa? So let's consider that in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, first of all, misukenet. Now, an animal that's misukenet, again, a misukenet is an animal that's very ill, that's very weak, and you rush to shecht it before it dies, right? So our Mishnah said, if it moves its foot, it's enough. But how do you know that's mutter at all? Mimai desharia. What do you mean? How do you know it's mutter? Why wouldn't it be mutter? Meaning, why are you assuming that there's a problem? What's the issue? It says, no. The reason I'm assuming that, because the pasuk says, Zot hachaya asher tochelu. This is a chaya that you should eat. And the Torah, the word chaya, tells us that the animal should be full of life, meaning you shouldn't eat things that are dying. Chaya achol, if it's living, then you should eat it. If it's eno chaya, if it's not destined to live, lo tochal, you shouldn't eat it. V'ha misukenet eno chaya. And so a misukenet is not going to live. It's dying. It's a dying animal, right? It's not a treifa necessarily because you don't have a wound in it, but it's clearly dying. And obviously that is very common. All animals die, right? Eventually, like all people. But so all, animal's sick, it's elderly or whatever, it's weak, it's not drinking, it's not standing, it's going to die. So maybe that's not kosher. Maybe only a chaya can be eaten. Says, how do you know it's mutar? Says the Gemara, because since the Torah tells us, nivela lo tochal, it says don't eat an animal that is dead, right? So implying that if you shechted it 1 minute before it died, you can eat it. Michlal misukenet sharia. It must be that if it's a misukenet, it's an ill animal that you shechted, it would be permitted. Because if a misukenet was asur, meaning an animal that was sick, even if you shechted it, you couldn't eat. So then why do you need a pasuk to tell me you can't eat a nevela? Hashta mechayim asira, if an animal is asur, even when it's sick and it's still alive, lachar mita mibai, when it's dead, it for sure would be prohibited, right? So you wouldn't need a pasuk for nevela if a misukenet was asur. So the fact that the Torah asurs a dead animal means that a living animal, even a very sick living animal, must be mutar. Says, well, how do you know? Maybe when we say nevela, we mean misukenet. Dilma hanu nevela, hanu misukenet. Maybe it's the same thing. Meaning maybe nevela literally means the animal is falling on the ground. But maybe a deathly ill animal is essentially a nevela. So how do you know that there's a separate category of misukenet that is permitted? It says, that does not seem logical. Because there's another pasuk that says, This is a second pasuk about nevela. This pasuk is from Shmini. It says, "V'chiyamut min habeima asher haya hi lachem la'achla." Right? If an animal that you're supposed to eat, that you're intending to eat, dies, hanogeya benivlata, right? If you touch the animal, that's the end of the pasuk. For we're quoting. The pasuk continues, "Yitzmad ha'arif." Okay, but the pasuk clearly says that in order for an animal to be called a nevela and to become tamei, it has to die, right? Chiyamut. So that tells you la'achar mitahu dekayir rachmana nevela. Only when it's dead does the Torah call the animal nevela. Mechayim lo ikri nevela. When it's alive, even if it's a sick animal, it's not called a nevela. The Torah clearly says if the animal dies, it's a nevela. There's more, well, maybe not. Maybe Dilma la'olam emalacha hainu nevela hainu misukenet. Maybe in fact, a nevela is a misukenet, I mean, or the opposite. A misukenet is a nevela, but the Torah is basically saying, look, an animal that's misukenet, an animal that's ill, that's about to die, you can't eat because it's essentially a nevela, right? But that's a mitzvat aseh. It's saying a chaya tochlu. You only eat animals that are alive. And now a second pasuk comes to say, and if it dies, we add another prohibition. We add a lotase. So maybe mechayim ba'aseh, that when the animal was alive, meaning, and then you shechted it, so it didn't actually drop dead, you shechted it before it died, you still can't eat it because there's an aseh that says only eat living animals. And la'achar mita b'lav, after it dies, you add on, it's not, you don't necessarily take away the aseh, but you add a lav, right? That says a lotase, which of course is stricter than an aseh, and so is an addition. So you can't really prove yet that a misukenet, an animal that is ill and dying, is so different than a nevela and that it's mutter. So what says where you're right? We give up on this proof for a minute. We'll get back to it. Ella, you know what our proof is? There's another pasuk. Da'amar Rachmana, there's a pasuk that says treifa lo tochal. The Torah says don't eat a treifa, right? Now, of course, we understand that this means an animal that's a treifa that you then shecht properly, right? Animal got into a fight, its liver was ripped apart by another animal. You go and it's alive though, right? It's wounded. You shecht that animal, that's a treifa. The pasuk says treifa lo tuchal. What that implies, says the Gemara, is michal the misukenet sharia. It must be that an animal that is not a treifa, meaning it's an ill animal but has no visible wounds, is mutar. Why? If you said that a misukenet, a sick animal, was prohibited, then I would have concluded hashta misukenet, an animal that's sick, but it has no wounds in it. It's not missing any parts, meaning there's no hole in the lungs, there's no piece missing from the liver. It's asira, and it's still asur because it's sick. So then a treifa mibai, why would you need a pasuk to tell me that you can't eat a treifa? Obviously, if you can't eat a dying animal that has no wounds, it's just naturally dying, or it has an infection or whatever, you can't eat, or old age, right? You can't eat an animal that is dying because it's got wounds in it. Says the Gemara, well, not necessarily, because maybe, and Tosas is bothered, we could have said the same answer earlier, but Dilma, hainu treifa, hainu misukenet. Maybe, in fact, it's the exact same thing. An animal that has dying is an animal that's dying, whether it's dying because it got attacked by another animal and is wounded, or it's dying because it's dying of natural causes. It's a treifa, basically. It's the same thing. Why are there two psukim? Why does a pasuk have to come say treifa lo tochelo if we already know zota chaya that you can only eat an animal that's going to live? It's lavar lav basei v'lo tasei. It's to tell you that there's both an asei of chaya and a lota say of trefa lo tochlo. So maybe you should expand your horizons and think of every misukenet as a trefa. Says the Gemara, well, imkain, if that was true, that every misukenet was a trefa, nivela, the katuv rachmana lamali, then why would I need to say that you can't have a nivela? Because again, if this animal, its only fault is that it's dying, only fault. It has no wounds, but it's about to die. So says the pasuk, don't eat it. So then, of course, if it died, you couldn't eat it, right? So if even an animal that's alive that you shecht, you'd be over a lav and an asay. If it dropped dead and you found it on the ground, or you shot it through the head, certainly you don't need a pasuk to tell me that after it dies, it also has an asay and a lotase. Remember earlier we tried to explain that we said nevela because we're adding a lotase, but we already know it from treifa. Says well, maybe it's all the same thing. Dilma, 6 lines from the bottom, hainu nevela, Hainu treifa, hainu misukenet. Maybe really animals that die are all the same. And the Torah says three different prohibitions to tell you that there's three different things that you're over when you do it. Lavar lav b'shnei lavin va'aseh, which you can tell is a very far-fetched explanation. But we're really pushing this to try to understand how can you prove that an animal that's misukenet, which again is an animal that's dying, is permitted if you shecht it. Ella says, we're going to start all over. We're going to bring a whole new proof. Mehacha. There's a pasuk that says the following. This
Rabbi,
is
why is that far-fetched? We have other lotases that have multiple
well, I,
multiple
I mean, I say it's
lotases.
far-fetched because I all my whole life I know that there's differences. But the other reason I say it's a little far-fetched, which the Gemara does not uses it, is that remember there's different details, right? The Torah has specific halachot about nevela, about tuma, and specific halachot about treifa, about giving it away to the dogs. It doesn't seem in the Torah to equate these three things together. But the Gemara is saying it's possible that they're very similar. Ella, 5 lines from the bottom. Sorry, this is the proof that again that a misukenet is permitted. Sorry, not prohibited, permitted. The pasuk is the following. It says in the pasuk, the chelev. This is again as a pasuk in earlier in Tzav. The chelev nevela, the chelev treifa, the fat from an animal. Now remember, fats of an animal, the chelev of an animal is never allowed to be eaten. Right, you're not allowed to eat the chelev of a behema. Right. So from birth, you can't eat it. So if you shech the behema, you're supposed to take out the chelev and not eat it. Says the Torah, chelev of a nevela, of an animal that dropped dead, and chelev treifa, those things, of course, you can't eat them, right? Well, we'll say that. Ya'aseh l'kol malacha, but you get hana'ah from them, right? You can take this fat and make it into whatever industrial purpose. The achol lo tochlenu, right? And you're not allowed to eat them. Now, of course, you're not allowed to eat them. What do you mean? You were a nevela was born, an animal was born with its chelev not being allowed to be eaten. So v'amar mar. Now, as we discuss this pasuk, this Gemara in Zvachim, right? Yeah, the Gemara in Zvachim said, "Lamai hilchot amra Torah." Why in the world did the Torah say don't eat a nevela, don't eat chelev of a nevela? We know you can't eat chelev of any animal. Says the Gemara, this is the Gemara in Zvachim. It's to tell you, Yavo Isur Nevela, V'yachul al Isur Chelev. It's to tell you that, look, when this animal was born, it had an Isur Chelev. But now it also, Isur of Chelev, yeah. Now that it dropped dead, it becomes a Nevela. So it's a second Isur. Remember, we discussed this all in Zvachim, that you can have a second Isur when it's Mosif on the first Isur, right? The Chelev was one level of Isur, but Nevela is even greater level. Anyways, that was a Gemara there. And furthermore, Yavo Isur Treifa v'Yichal Isur Chelev. The Torah is telling me that the Isur of Treifa and Nevela come and add on to the Isur of Chelev. Well, says the Gemara, what's the proof from here? Turn the page to Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Bet. Isal Kedaitach Treifa Hainu Misukenet. If you're telling me this argument now that a Treifa is essentially a Misukenet and is a Nevela, so then why does the Torah have to say different descriptions? Why does it say chelev treifa and chelev nevela? Lichtov rachmana chelev nevela ya'aseh l'chol melacha. Let it just say chelev of a nevela can be done for anything. V'chelev treifa lo tochlenu. And the chelev of treifa don't eat. Meaning, the Torah is not adding anything by saying nevela and treifa. And if a treifa is the same thing as a misukenet, we only need to talk about eating by a treifa. And what would I have concluded from there? Ma anamina, I would have said, third line, ma michayim, an animal that's alive, right? Because a misukenet is alive, or a treifa is alive too. But take a misukenet that's alive. Ati isur treifa chal isur chelev. The fact, even though it's alive, right? The fact that it's either dying or has a wound means that a second Isser of Treifa comes and adds to the Isser of Chelev, so that if you then eat this Chelev, you're over 2 Issurim. Lachar mita mi boy. Certainly, if it's dead, the Isser of Nevela can be Chal on the Isser of Chelev. And so if it was true that this could happen while it was alive, then there'd be a huge advantage to saying Treifa and no need to say Nevela. The fact that the Torah said treifa and nevela suggests that they're both after death. Not you couldn't say that one of them, treifa, meaning is also when it's alive, because otherwise you'd conclude nevela without a pasuk. Ella midikatav rachmana nevela, since the Torah spoke out that a nevela also can't eat the chelev, nechlal de treifa lav hainu misukenet. So I conclude from here that a treifa does not encompass a misukenet. And so chelav nevela and chelav treifa is prohibited to be eaten because of isser adding on to another isser. But an animal that's alive and is dying but has no visible wound, so it's not a treifa, is permitted to be eaten if you shecht it. Okay? Now the question of our Mishnah is, assuming that's true, we're going to keep asking questions on it, but assuming what I just said is true, what does dying mean? Right? Meaning, what's that line between the animal is dead, essentially, and if you shecht it, you can't eat it, or it's almost dead, and if you shecht it, you can eat it. And that's where our Mishnah gave us several definitions that, and there's a machloket, but several definitions about if the animal moves after you shecht it, if it what's it called, squirts blood. So there's several definitions. So that is the first proof, right? Says the Gemara, well, I still don't think it's a great proof. Matkifla Mar bar Rav Ashi, asked Mar bar Rav Ashi, I'm not convinced. Why am I not convinced? Because Dilma lo'olam im lecha hainu treifa hainu misukenet. I could say that maybe a treifa is a misukenet. And the whole reason why we proved from this pasuk that a treifa and a misukenet are separate is because we said that if basically a treifa included a misukenet, meaning included a living animal, then I would for sure know nevela and I wouldn't need the extra pasuk. But maybe, to Ka'amrit, you asked on that interpretation, nevela t'katav rachmana lamali, right? Why do you need to say nevela? Because essentially, right, every animal that dies, before it died, it was a misukenet, right? You can't die without being nearly dead. That's a fact, right? So if a misukenet, again, which means an animal with no visible wound, but dying animal is prohibited, then a dead animal is for sure prohibited. Says beautifully, Mar bar Rav Ashi, it's not true, right? Because not every dead animal was dying. Some animals are killed quickly, right? Lamali, what would you need it for? You need it lahach nevela d'lo atya mikoch misukenet. There's some animals that die without being sick before they die. They weren't deathly ill. Vehechidami. And what is an example of an animal that dies without being misukenet? Shasa gistra. Take an animal and just chop off its head. Remember, gistra always means you chop it in half without doing shchita, right? So you just basically kill an animal. It wasn't sick. It wasn't dying, right? It had no illness. It was in its perfect health, and it got dropped off a bridge, let's say, or a huge knife fell on it. Says, well, still, even in that case, you can always reduce it to moments and seconds, right? Hatamnami, iefshar delo havi misukenet porta mikami delifsik leruba. In one split second, it was dying before it died, right? There's always time. So it was a misukenet when you cut it a little bit before you cut the whole animal in half, right? So there's no such thing, says the Gemara. Now, this is the answer, which also is not the strongest answer, that there's no such thing as an animal that dies without being dying on the way, right? And even if an animal dies very suddenly, an instant before it died, an instant before you cut off its head or cut through its body, it was on its way without being quite dead. And so therefore, the proof is, again, so we're sticking with the original proof, that if a misukenet, an animal that was dying, was prohibited, then you would know for sure that a nevela, which is the animal that's dead, is prohibited. From the fact that we have to say treifa and nevela, it tells you that a dying animal that's not a treifa, meaning it has no wound and no obvious reason why it's going to die, is not prohibited. Again, with the caveat that there has to be some sign of life after shechita, and we'll talk as we go further, probably tomorrow, more of what that sign has to be. So that's one answer. Ibai Dema, says the Gemara, there's another answer. And the other answer is much simpler. Forget about all this logic. It's because the pasuk says chelev nevela and chelev treifa, and the word chelev is repeated, which is extra. Im came lema chelev nevela u treifa. Just say together nevela and treifa, because you're basically, if they were all the same category. The fact that it says chelev chelev, it repeats the word chelev twice, lamali, it's to tell you zuhi shein chaba chaluk mi bisara. This animal, meaning a treifa and a nevela, the fat which is not different than the basar, meaning just like you can't eat the meat of a nevela, and you can't eat the meat of a treifa, you also can't eat the fat of a nevela and a treifa. But yesh lecha acheret, there's another animal, shechelba chaluk mi basara, There's another animal where the chelev is different than the meat, meaning you can't eat the chelev, but you can eat the meat. Vezu, and which one is this? Zu misukenet. So the second answer is that we're basically learning it from the extra word chelev to tell you that this is the only case where chelev is, but there's another case, namely misukenet, where chelev is prohibited, but the meat is not prohibited. So that's the second answer. And then we come up with a third answer, which is very exciting because it's from Yecheskel, which I'm learning now, so I'm very excited about. The third answer is from a pasuk in Yecheskel. Now, of course, we don't love to bring proofs from pasukim in Yecheskel for many reasons. One is because it's not the Torah, right? It's I wouldn't say a secondary source, but it's a less direct source. The second, as you're going to see, is that it's not that Yecheskel says this explicitly. It's a little bit of a limit from Yecheskel. But the second one is from the pasuk in Yecheskel, and this pasuk comes in the beginning of Yecheskel, in Perek Daled. I'm pretty sure I have it here. Yep, Yecheskel Daled Yud Daled, where Yecheskel is basically talking about how great he is. Okay, or he's defending himself, and he talks about how he doesn't do a lot of. He's going to enumerate a few sins, and the Gemara is obviously bothered that Yecheskel gets up and says, I never killed someone, right? That's not like a big shakes, you never did that. So we're going to ask what he's talking about. So says the pasuk, we're around halfway down, Lamed Zayin Amud Bet. Says the pasuk, Va'omer, I said, Aha Hashem Elohim, right? Aha, whatever, attention. God, Hinei nafshi lo mituma. I never made my soul tameh. I never became tameh. Remember, Yecheskel was a Kohen. So I never became tameh. Unevelo trefa lo achalti minurai varata. I never ate nevela and trefa. I never went to McDonald's. Okay. Velo bab nifi basar pigul. And I never ate meat that was pigul. Okay. So therefore I'm great and whatever. The continuation is not so important. But the Gemara is, of course, very bothered, and several times we're going to have this. What's the big deal? What do you mean? Cheskel, congratulations. You never ate pigul, right? That's not like the greatest achievement of any human being. It's what you're expected. So we reinterpret this, and we interpret it to mean, when I say Hinei nafshi lo mituma, it doesn't mean that I didn't become tamei. Of course I didn't become tamei. I'm a Kohen. I can't become tamei. It means that, of course, there's tuma, like carry, like ejaculation, which can happen involuntarily. So it says Yecheskel, I made efforts so that I would never be turned on, so that while I was sleeping, I would, involuntarily or subconsciously or unconsciously become tamei. So that takes a lot of effort. Shelo hirharti b'yom, I didn't have thoughts of sexual, things during the day. Lavoli de tuma b'layla. So that's what he means. That it's not just I obviously didn't walk into a house with a dead body. I was very careful that I wouldn't lead to become tumat carry. And then when it says, which again is not relevant for us, unevelo trefa lo chati minurai ad ve'ad ata, right? I didn't eat a nevela and trefa from when I was a young person till now. What does that mean? So we understand that doesn't mean he didn't eat nevela. Of course he didn't eat nevela. That Yecheskel didn't go to McDonald's again is not a big compliment. It's that shelo achalti basar kos me'olam. I never ate meat that was kos, right? Kos means they were calling out, this animal is sick, right? And they basically said, come, right? Shecht it. So we got to shech this animal really quickly because it's about to die, right? So says Yecheskel, even though that is permitted, and that's the proof from our Mishnah, I was very strict with myself. I never ate an animal where they were saying, kos means to shecht it, right? To cut off its head. Kill it, right? So if they got to the point where they were like rushing to kill this animal, even though it's permitted, I was machmer on myself and I never ate it. So that's the proof we're going to have from Yecheskel. Let's just read the third one. The third thing he said was, Lo ba b'fi basar pigol. I never ate pigol. Now says, well, again, what do you mean you never ate pigol? Of course you didn't eat pigol. Pigol is an isser karet. I hope you didn't eat pigol. No, what it means is, remember, pigul comes from something where you have a machshava, where you ask someone about, you have an improper thought. What it means is, shlo achalti mi be'ima shehoreb bo chacham. I never ate an animal that they required a chacham's opinion to be permitted. Meaning, if someone shechted their animal and they said, oh boy, something's wrong with the lungs, let's go ask the rabbi. I already said, even if the rabbi says it's permitted, the fact that you got to go to the rabbi means that there's some question about it. And I stayed away from anything that's questionable. And so that is what he meant. There's one other explanation. That what he meant is, I never ate an animal where they didn't give the matanot. Remember, you have to give certain parts of the animal, the zroa, the chayayim, and the keva, which we'll have later in the parak. In yeah, we'll have later. So that you have to give the Zroa L'Chaim, and not the parak in the Masechta. You have to give the Zroa L'Chaim in Kiva, the parts of the animal. The Zroa means the leg, and the L'Chaim is the jaw. The Kiva is some part of the stomach. To the Kohen. Now, of course, the animal's not possible if you don't do that, right? If the restaurant owner is supposed to do that. If he doesn't do it, it doesn't make it not kosher. But Reb Cheskel said, I was makbid. If you didn't do things properly, I didn't eat it. But basically, what we prove from here says, if an animal that's dying and they announce, slaughter it, that animal is permitted technically, then I understand that Yecheskel says, but I was careful. That's where Yecheskel can say, I was very careful. I never went to the barbecues if that's the kind of meat they had. But if it was prohibited, so my Yecheskel. So then what's the big shakes with Yecheskel saying that he didn't do this? So that's the proof. Again, it's a third proof, I would say, because we don't generally prove things from Navi, but it's what we learn from Yecheskel. Now, says the Gemara today, we have a few more lines, I'd say, 10 more lines from the bottom, right? 10 or so. Back to our Mishnah. Hechidami misukanet. What is an animal that's dying? Meaning, how do you define it? Again, it's not a treifa. So there's no visible or known injury or wound in this animal, but it's clearly failing. How could you define that? Amrav Yudah Marav, the answer is if it can't stand under its own weight. Koshma midinoto ve'eno meret. You stand the animal up and it can't stand. If an animal falls down, then it's a misukanet. Says Rabbi Chanina Bar Shammai Mishmei Derav Amru, I want to be clear. Afilo ochelet b'kaiut, even if it can eat b'kiut, which means what essentially pieces of wood, right? Meaning it can chew on very, very strong things. The fact that its jaw works and that the animal could keep eating is not a proof that it has life left in it. So animals eating, even animals that are dying, I don't know if people are like this, can do a lot of damage with their jaw. But that doesn't mean the animal has enough life or blood in circulation to stand up, and therefore it's a misukanet. And Rami Bar Yecheskel said, "Afilo chelt korot." Even if it's eating korot are beams of wood. Meaning, even if the animal's chewing away on the thickest things, that's not a proof that it's strong enough to live. Now that's what they said in Surah. Besura Matni Hachi, what we just told you was the exchange that they had in Surah. Remember that Surah was the place where Rav lived and taught, and his students, like Rav Yehuda, we're about to quote, were his Talmidim in Surah. Now, when Rav died in Surah, there was still yeshiva, Rav Huna was left, but many of the students, including Rav Yehuda, went to Pumbedita to learn with Shmuel. So when later in Pumbedita, Matni Hachi, they went to Narada and then Pumbedita. But anyways, in Pumbedita, they had this version. Hechidami misukanet. What is a animal that's dying? Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. Here we quote it again, same as before. Rav Yehuda Marav. Kol shma midino tov eno omeret. Any animal that is, you stand it up and it doesn't stand. And then Rav Yehuda Marav is the one who said, "Bafilo ochelt bekiut," even if it's eating wood. And Rami Bar Yecheskel Amar filo ochelt korot, even if it's eating these beams of wood. Again, it's the same opinions, but just the names. Rav Yehuda Marav now said an extra addition. So that's what a misukanet is. Now, I'm going to read a few more lines, if that's okay, because we're not too late. But says the Gemara now, 3 lines from the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. Ashkechinu Shmuel the Talmidei Rav. Again, this is relevant to what I just said before. When Rav died, many of his students left. They didn't have a teacher anymore. They didn't feel connected, and they went to Shmuel, basically in the whole north of Buffalo, very different area, to learn with him or to be part of that yeshiva. So there's a lot of stories like this, like we're about to have, where Shmuel, Ashkechinu Shmuel, the Talmidei de Rav. Shmuel bumps into the students of Rav. Again, they're unnamed here. They're the students of Rav. Amarlo, and Shmuel said to them, "My Amar Rav misukanet." Right? What did Rav say? Meaning besides our Mishnah, of course, we have a Mishnah. But what did Rav say to describe what animal is permitted if it's a misukanet? Right? Meaning, when can you show from the animal's actions that it still has life in it, so that if you then shecht it, it's kosher. So Amrulai, so they said to Shmuel, Hachi Amar Rav. Rav said, the top of that Lamechet Amin Aleph, a few interesting things. Go'eh. If an animal, I don't know how to translate. Go'eh means like I say braise always because that's what a donkey, I guess, would do, but makes noise, right? Miriam, do you have an English word of go'eh? Maybe you're muted, but
Goa.
yeah, top word of Daf Lamed.
Lowe's.
Lows.
release,
Yeah.
yeah, lows. Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, I
It
don't
means
I
it
don't know what
makes
word.
the low mooing sound characteristic of cows.
Right, thank you. Moos, we'll say, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
Gemara, the Gemara tomorrow actually is going to discuss whether it's a deep moo or a quiet moo, so we'll get into animal sounds tomorrow, so don't get too excited. But if it makes some noise as you're shechting it, then it's clearly still alive. Or hitila rei, or if it passes stool, right? If it defecates during death, or kishkishaba azno, or wiggles its ears. So all of those things, hareze pirchus, that counts as an animal moving, and if the animal does that, you can eat the meat. Amrlu, so Shmuel said to them, Istrichele la Abba la azuze oni. Did Abba is the way Shmuel would call Rav, we'll see why in a second. Did Abba really require an animal like azuze oni is a very, I guess, delicate action. That animal has to really be alive to move its ear. Sha'ani Omer, I say, said Shmuel, Kol she'ena osed dvarim shamita osa. Any action that an animal does that is not an action that's associated with death is considered to be an action. Now, tomorrow, because we're constrained by the daf, we're not allowed to go forward, we're going to ask what Shmuel means by dvarim that happen during death, meaning what are the things that are death actions, and anything, Shmuel is basically saying anything else would make it an animal that's permitted. We will, God willing, pick up tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. from the fourth line. I just want to point out, I think it's always a fun Rashi and Tosfot debate, right? Shmuel often refers to Rav as Abba, like he did here. So Rashi here says that he referred to him that as a name of kavod. Abba is a name, father, basically. He called him, he was not his father, obviously. Shmuel's father's name, Nava knows, of course, was Avua de Shmuel, right? So Shmuel's father was also called Abba in the Gemara, but he would refer to Rava that way. Rob, sorry, that way. Tosfos here has an opinion which he says all the time, which is that that's not the case. That in fact Rav's name was Abba, and that he was called Rav, like we call the Rav, right? That's Rav was the honorific, Abba was his name, and so
Yeah.
Shmuel, who was on good relation, Shmuel was his peer, would say, "Oh, that's what Abba said," right? But then other people called him Rav as an honorary name. So anyway, it's always a very interesting machloket. I know we're in the middle of the sugya, so I hope we'll see everyone tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. Hope we can make it. And Shavua Tov. We'll see you tomorrow.
Shavua tov. Thank you.
Good night.